Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is 8th of October and we have some really interesting updates from southern Donetsk, starting off with Zolota Nyva and an area northwest of Vodiane. We'll also look at the Vovchansk river fronts and the Siversk salient, where we have a really interesting update and advance towards the capture of a village that has been at the line of contact for a really long time. Kharkiv front also has some important changes. In Vovchansk, the Russians did advance and take back the aggregate plan, so we're going to look at that. And then they also advanced in Kursk, so that will all be on the menu for today. But I do just want to shout out a smaller channel that is starting out. I'll leave their link in the description, Geographilia, and they are focusing on these shorter animated videos that, again, include all global conflicts, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, and so I recommend watching them if you're into that sort of concise and really high produced format. And now let's begin with the video. You're going to see here that there was a Russian advance. 2 geolocations confirmed the capture of the village of Zolota Nyva. You could see it's just to the west of Prechestivka, and it really only was a matter of time before the Russians captured it. The reason why it didn't happen earlier is because a lot of the resources involved with this axis westwards along the highway towards Velika Novosilka, they were diverted to attack in Vuhledar, or at least provide support on the northwestern flank of Vuhledar when the Russians over there took over the garages and fired towards the Ukrainian retreat points, creating a lot of chokeholds for those Ukrainian forces withdrawing. But now that the situation there has really finalized, and there are, of course, movements towards Bohoyavlenka, but now less forces need to be involved. You do have the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade being redirected and involved with the storming of this really small village, which I don't even know if it was under Ukrainian control or a gray zone at the time because of how close it is to the Kashlach River, and it's just not fortified on a valley. It's just very difficult to hold on there. But regardless of what the status was before, after, we could see here on October 6th, 40th Naval Infantry Brigade, they stormed it with 6 vehicles. They provided suppressive fire towards the entire housing area. And then in additional geolocations, you can see actually a Russian flag being raised along one of the roads over here. So yeah, there is pretty confident control. And that's actually the final village on the road to Velika Novosilka from this specific highway. This highway, again, if you have to really advance 10 kilometers, so it is a long track, but a lot of this area is relatively open. There are tree lines, of course, and so each one will be fought over. And then over here to the north, just east of Velika Novosilka, here you actually do have some horizontal defenses, but it won't have as much bearing if you're looking at a specific advance along the highway, coupled with advances that are the Russians are trying to embark upon to a smaller extent south of Makarivka. So there is two-pronged attack, which is developing. It's not really a high Russian priority, which is why the pace is not really there, but it is something that is definitely on the menu for the future. Looking at Vodiane, you're going to zoom in and see the Russians are expanding past the original staging points in the village. It's now being used as an organization center for Russian attack squads. And the immediate goal would be to get control over the routes that lead directly into Bohoyavlenka. And that includes this one over here where I'm going over with the arrows. So that's a part of the equation. The other part is to just dismantle any sort of Ukrainian presence within these horizontal fortifications that are providing some sort of flank support for Bohoyavlenka. And now you see the Russians starting with that based on a video from October 8th. Russian vehicle dismounted troops in a tree line west of Vodiane. It retreated quickly under pressure due to several Ukrainian Baby Yagas being present in the skies, and it was filmed by a Russian drone that was at the end of the video taken down, knocked down by one of those Baby Yaga drones. And so you actually saw some drone-to-drone combats, interestingly. And that is, again, confirmation the Russians are now trying to move forward. They have not taken yet, from what we can see here, an operational pause. Of course, there are certain units that are not as active now as they were during the climax of Vuhledar or during the original clearing operations east of the 0532 highway. But due to the abundant amount of units in this region, there is an ability to conduct rotations that we've seen present. Like the 40th Brigade is now really present in certain areas. And you could see a lot of that based on my previous videos or on my map over here. Just to go northwards, the Russians continue to solidify control over additional portions of the eastern bank of the Vovchansk River. In the Salient region, the Ukrainians continue to drag out the fighting. A lot of it is being done by the 21st Special Purpose Battalion. It's part of the Presidential Brigade, which is really having its battalion split across the entire front line. You can see here Russian advances amounting to 6.71 square kilometers. This includes some of the northwestern warehouses of Krasnohorivka. These areas actually do have dugouts and were well defended. It's why it took so long to eventually clear it out. The Russians weren't really taking it as a high priority because they were focused and still are focused really extensively on Tsukuryne and fighting in Ukraine, etc. And so there wasn't as much of an emphasis put on advancing and getting control over every single square meter of open field area where they knew the Ukrainians were not much of a threat anyway. And so they let the Ukrainians remain in some of these regions and just constantly bombarded the open areas. And now you can see some of the consolidation in areas where there are no longer Ukrainian squads present. Also, then a bit to the southwest of Zolota Nyva, there was a Russian advance through this forested area. It's only recently, over the past 2 days, where Ukrainian sources in unison have confirmed the capture of Zolota Nyva, but we've known about it for a couple of weeks now based on geolocated footage. Now, looking at Tsukuryne, this is really, really bad, in the sense that the Russians have now reached the bisecting point of that village between the residential areas and then some other houses and warehouses. The issue is, following a Russian capture of this area, a lot of Ukraine's nearby rear is going to be exposed from several axes. The most immediate one that you could see on the map is southwards towards an area like Novoselyadivka, where there are already mentions from the Ukrainian side of Russian DRG operatives beginning to harass the defense line around here. And that could also have ramifications for Izmailivka. But really, the objective would be to cut off the Ukrainians that are defending in Kharkiv and other really important cities that are west of the Vovchansk River from the wider Ukrainian defensive structure in Donetsk. And you could see that it's not that far away from where the current line of contact is. And Tsukuryne would be the perfect sort of stepping stone to do so. Right now, the minimum, or I should say maximum extent in terms of closeness, it's about 8.2 kilometers away. So there still is time, but there aren't many paved roads that are going horizontally and connecting between the two areas that I'm hovering over with my mouse. In any case, it would also lead to this exposing of a relatively open area just west of Tsukuryne and Kremlina Balka. These are relatively small villages that aren't prepared for large-scale defending with actual trenches across their entire perimeter. You can see based on the trench map that a lot of them were built horizontally, with the implication being they were expecting a Russian attack from the south, not necessarily from an eastern direction. And then it means that the efficacy of long-term defending is diminished. And so more generally, this would be compromising for Selidove's southern flank and for the southern flank of all of the villages located along the rail line that extends northwest of Selidove. So it is important, and just keep an eye out for whether the Ukrainians move in additional reinforcements to this region just to hold on and prevent a certain blooming of the Russian attack over here, whether it be southwards or westwards. Now, to zoom in on Chasiv Yar, here's a geolocation. It was released by the 24th Mechanized Brigade. They are really responsible for the defensive activities here, especially near the Donbass Canal, specifically in the Oktyabrski district. This is the micro district that has experienced the most fighting within Chasiv Yar proper, just to the west, not necessarily in this micro district to the east. So they were moved away from Toretsk in the late June period, and since then they've been immense in holding on. So their FPV crews were involved in this compilation, just targeting Russian squads that were moving from house to house, basement to basement, through the backyards and what it may be, and targeting them individually. And of course, leads to casualties being yielded. And in addition to that, they were targeted in areas that previously were considered either under Ukrainian control or a gray zone. So it does indicate that Russian Marines, or not Marines, but VDV forces from whether it be 98th Division or some of the other elements that are involved here, were able to move westwards and capture additional territory. And now it means that a large chunk of this micro district is no longer under Ukrainian control. A lot of it is still in a gray zone just due to the nature of the houses being really decimated in a lot of cases. It's hard to take up permanent positions in those particular areas. Looking at the Siversk salient, I discussed it in one of my earlier videos this past week or 2 weeks. And I said that Siversk really is a good gauge for the way in which the entire front line is going, in the sense that the Ukrainians here, they do have a very strong defensive apparatus that has been able to really hold on despite numerous assaults from several axes in positions that really make it look like it's in a sort of semicircle almost. And so it is a healthy defense most of the time. And so then when you see fractures there, it is sort of a microcosm of the broader situation on the front line, especially given the fact that for most of the conflict, the Siversk salient has been one of Russia's lower frontline priorities in the sense that less rations may be devoted to this area, less units may be deployed here, less Air Force sorties are directed specifically at targeting Ukrainian positions here. But despite that fact, now we're seeing certain Russian advances that really wouldn't have been imaginable if you're looking at a situation half a year ago or a year ago. To zoom in, there's a few geolocations that confirm the order of battle in this area. So this is not from September 8th, it's from October 8th. It's from the Zarya Battalion. This is a important drone unit in Russia's 123rd Motor Rifle Brigade. That's a part of the 3rd Army Corps. And 3rd Army Corps, again, created in 2022. The specific brigade is operating in this region. They're involved with a lot of the pushes along the rail line directly south of Vimka. So the compilation just showed a litany of FPVs and drones dropping grenades onto Ukrainian positions that really are built in conjunction with the windbreaks on the rail line and the embankment created as a result, and a lot of the forested region in the area. So that's why it's so difficult to break through in this region. You have very, very particular narrow routes that have to be passed through, and then you have Ukrainians standing there that have a lot of experience because you have a very strong core of units that have not been rotated in and out that much. Maybe they do have localized rotations, but the general brigade has still been operating here for many months or years, and so they have a really well-versed understanding of every single plot of land. But in any case, looking northwards, this is an area where you, at least based on a topographical level, will not really assume there would be a Russian advance. This is in Verkhovno-Kamyansk. This is one of the lowest elevated regions in the Siversk salient. I'll mark it in X, this area on a low-lying valley feeding directly into Siversk. It is still important as a target, though, because the road that bisects it, it's also a paved road leading into the eastern entrance to Siversk. So the fact that the Russians advance through here, it will give them a really important route for future attacks, although I think that they're going to focus first on securing their flanks. You can see here it's an advance amounting to 8.8 square kilometers, so it is large. And the Russian MOD a couple of days ago, they did confirm the capture of this, and I said we should wait for additional confirmation. But given the fact that they were making such a out in the open declaration about an area that has not been discussed that much recently, it did seem like probably they weren't going to lie about that, and now I actually have proof of it because you have a news report from October 8th. So this is a news report from the Western Edge, and the fact that the media is already operating in that region, it does mean that probably there is a sort of couple kilometer gray zone between the solid Ukrainian lines and the eastern outskirts of Siversk and where the Russians are currently operating here. This is a report talking about the 6th Motor Rifle Brigade. It's a unit that previously was stationed, I believe, in Zaporizhia, and now they've been moved to this region here and were involved in the offensive activity. So they took over the village. First, it started with a very large-scale bombardment with artillery and FPVs, and of course, given the small concentration of Verkhovno-Kamyansk, that sort of damage eventually compounds and leads to really making it hard to defend long-term, especially against storming operations. And so then the 6th Brigade did conduct this large storming activity throughout the village and utilize the main road to push all the way to the western edge, pushing out the Ukrainian garrison, which probably was composed of the 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade. And there are some other units in the area that are pretty well known. Svoboda Battalion is one of them. It's a part of the Rapid Reaction Brigade, and they are involved in a lot of the fighting. You have one battalion of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade. The other one, I believe, is in Kupiansk. You have some territorial defense units that have been here for a while. Of course, you have the 54th Mechanized Brigade. So it's a core. It's not significantly large, but it is a specific core of units that have been here for a while and understand the local dynamics. Now, in terms of topography, the Russians to the north and south both have these salients that the Ukrainians are still in that are located on much higher elevation. You have Bilohorivka, which, especially its northern portions, are on a highly elevated hill, starting in Hryhorivka and Serebryanka. And so this is just the perfect position for Ukrainians to fire onto Verkhovno-Kamyansk. But on the flip side, getting into Bilohorivka for Ukrainian forces is difficult now because you have this flank to the south, and you already had significant pressure from Russian forces on similar elevation northeast of Bilohorivka in some other hilly areas. And besides that, Bilohorivka is not necessarily under full Ukrainian control. It can be solidly used as a staging base because it's been under this sort of subtle Russian attack for a while. And so I would expect that given this Verkhnokamiansk spearhead, and now there would be a focus shift towards just getting rid of these salients and then using those specific geographic advantages to attack towards the Siversk region. Then also south of Verkhnokamiansk, this area is relatively open. It's hard to see how it will be defended long term, but it is also located on rather high elevation or ridge. So that's an area the Russians would definitely be looking at taking over, not just for Siversk, but also for the entire trench defense line over here, and for the Ukrainian defenses built along the rail line regions and some of the western approaches to Siversk, which are also pretty well defended. Now, looking at the Kharkiv front, we are seeing a culmination of a lot of battles we've covered over the past month. Samokiivka, the Russian forces here are focusing on completing the combing operations, which include hills located just west of the village and also local roads and forested regions like ravines that are north of Samokiivka. So now this area is being cleared out. There are a few pockets of relatively strong Ukrainian presence. Most notably, this village, Myasozharivka, whatever it's pronounced, and then also this village over here. So those are of particular concern for the Russian forces before any deep advance. But you can see now, besides Lazova, there's no other village, no other organized settlements that the Russians have to take over for another 12 kilometers. And by that point, they would only be around like 4 kilometers away from the Oskil River itself. And that would put an enormous strain onto the Ukrainian connectivity on this Oskil River bridgehead from another location. You already have that with the Russian forces firing directly towards any movement going on in Kukhlyalivka and Kolesnikivka, and that's made it virtually impossible to go back and forth along this very narrow land strip. So anything that does come to and from has to be done through the Oskil River and then back, and of course that adds more time, and then the Russians begin focusing their airstrikes on those particular routes. So it is not something that is tenable long term to hold on to this strip. It's just simply not, given the size and that given the enormous pressure on such a small area. And something similar could be repeated a bit further south, especially when it comes to securing a large chunk of territory, because a lot of these regions are not that well dug into. There are ditches and forested areas, but not a lot of static defensive positions or basements in which to hide. So these are the perfect areas for large-scale Russian armored assaults, of which there are many Russian tank divisions and units that are operating in the general Svatove region. Then to zoom in and look at the cascading of events north of Pischane, we have this geolocation here from the Buriv National Guard Brigade. It's the 1st National Guard Brigade. They conducted FPV strikes. One of their vehicles fired towards the Russian positions, and just general MLRS fire onto Russian troops that were operating northwest of Tabaivka. Now, the status of Tabaivka and the Salient is pretty much unknown, but you can see how it's in a very uncomfortable position, given the fact that the Russians are in control of a populated area, Kislivka and Kotlyarivka, and then their vectors going on over here to the west. So any sort of pressure here is done with the intention of squeezing out the Ukrainians in these ravine and pond areas. And by that point, the Russians would be developing a really strong attack vector towards the southern flank of Kupiansk and generally other villages that are nearby that are also urban in nature. Now, to look at Vovchansk, we have a geolocation. We're going to zoom in and see this. It's from the Russian Army Group North, and you could see it's indicating Russian soldiers raising their flag in the aggregate plant once again after their withdrawal due to Ukrainians really forcing them out in a really significant effort that involved the 57th Brigade and probably also the 92nd Brigade. So they raised their flag once again in the eastern portions of the aggregate plants. So it's not just the entrance, it's actually relatively deep into it, which should give us an idea of how the entire domain is likely under either some gray zone regimen or Russian operational control. And this is interesting because the Russian forces were definitely forced out, and they made several attempts to enter since, but a lot of it was really aided by the fact that they launched a very significant airstrike barrage onto this region over the past week and a half. mainly consisting of FAB 1500s and also the ODAB 1500s, causing immense destruction to the areas here, which is something that did not happen in the initial Russian infiltration into the aggregate plants when they first attacked here. When was that? Like entering in July, August, something of that sort, if my memory serves me right. And so this time they had better preparation in that regard. Also, all of the roads leading to it, all of those regions were just pummeled and leveled to a large degree to allow for movement of Russian vehicles. And that helped them with their armored assaults, although some of them were repelled by the 57th Brigade, as was the one on September 29th. Eventually, it was enough to actually break through and dismount forces once again in the aggregate plants. So now the Russian forces are here. And then the question is, what's going on with the flanks? Probably they have control over this area that I'm marking with X to the north, because that was their previous vector of attack that was repelled by the Ukrainians. They probably ended up succeeding in going through that region to actually reach the area marked with the small X. And then we don't know necessarily what's going on with this apartment complex, which should still be under Ukrainian control, but now it's under increased pressure. And so just a long-term holding on to the aggregate plants, it's really needed in order to pin down a permanent Russian presence in the downtown region of northern Vovchansk. And then from there, we'll work to squeeze out the remaining large Ukrainian nodes, although that will take a long time. And now to finish off with Kursk, we're going to see that the Russian forces have continued with their counterattacks, this time entering into another cluster of Ukrainian-controlled villages. And it's very close to the paved road, one of the only paved roads going northwestwards towards the Ukrainian outskirts that are really important for Kuranovo. The entire Ukrainian contingency plan for the Kursk offensive really relies upon there being some sort of forward outpost in Kuranovo that would allow them to one day build up and then storm it. If they lose that potential due to the disconnection of this road over here in X, then eventually that will come back and cascade into all of the Kursk holdings being taken back and any sort of Ukrainian permanent settlement here not being possible. So it is very important that the Ukrainians maintain control of this paved road, which serves their armored elements really well. The Russian advance here, it's been admitted by the Ukrainian side. It amounts to 24 square kilometers. It is a large-scale advance from the previous cluster of villages, which includes Snagost and all of these regions that connect to Krasnoyarsk. Also, Obuchovka was taken over. We talked about that in earlier videos. But Lyubimovka, this is an area that's connected to some other villages like Tolskoy Lug, Pokrovsky, Nizhny Klin. All of them will be under threat if the Russians succeed in creating a permanent foothold in this area. So let's see where the actual geolocation confirming the attack is. It's from the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, and they dropped grenades and mines in addition to firing mortars onto the Russian squads that dismounted here and took it over, at least in its western boundary. And that's not enough to indicate that they were fully repelled, although the fighting here is ongoing. A bit to the east, Ukrainians tried sending reinforcements into the clash from the ground. They sent in a Rochelle Senator-wheeled armored car, and it was destroyed due to a flurry of grenades being dropped on it. And so this is generally where the battle lines are currently drawn. Russian forces that were involved in the earlier attacks, the beginning of last month, expanding south of Kuranovo, they've had some sort of minor operational pause over the past week and a half, and now they are resuming a lot of their offensive activities. And there is a large garrison that's trickled in over that time period. And so they're going to be committed to making this foothold permanent and then expanding from there into the paved road and southwards, and more generally branching out in all directions from that point. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.